Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the September Ford Evening Book Talk here at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. I'm Susan Schoelwer, and I am the Executive Director of Historic Preservation and Collections and the Robert H. Smith Senior Curator. I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this book talk, H. Richard Dietrich III. Richard is president of the Dietrich American Foundation. He has spent his career working in nonprofit management, having first started out in Washington, D.C. in government. He received his BA at Wesleyan University and an MBA from Yale University. He also serves on the board of the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Museum of American Revolution, as well as an environmental research and advocacy group in Maine called the Shaw Institute. So, as you can tell from that, Richard has a great background and interest in the arts, Americana, and collecting. And he is here tonight to talk to us about the recent publication of the Dietrich American Foundation, In Pursuit of History, a lifetime collecting colonial American art and artifacts. Richard, welcome.
Hi, Susan. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's great to be here tonight. It's an honor to be here with you and with the Mount Vernon audience. I kind of had a vision of ascending the steps to the stage and taking the podium. And while I wish that we could be there actually at Mount Vernon, I'm so honored that there's this platform that we can all at least assemble in the comfort of our living rooms and kitchens and offices. I do want to say a word or two about Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon's a place that's really near and dear to my heart, my wife's heart. It's a place that we visited a lot before we had kids and now that we have kids. And I just couldn't be more impressed with what Mount Vernon offers. But one of the things in particular is just the number of visitors that you get a year. Susan, I think it's 1.1 million, 1.2 million typically.
Typically about 1.1 million.
And so with COVID, I mean, obviously that's changing everything. And now guests are returning to Mount Vernon. And another thing that I think has been really impressive is just how Mount Vernon pivoted to welcome lectures like this. People like Susan and her staff of curators, Amy Turcotte playing the harpsichord. I saw a Zoom with Christopher Jackson, who so ably portrayed Washington and Hamilton the musical. And it's just an honor to be part of that lineup. So thank you. And what I'd like to talk about, as Susan mentioned, is a book. And it's this book, In Pursuit of History, A Lifetime Collecting Colonial Art and Artifacts. And the book is something that we as a foundation, the Dietrich American Foundation, decided to do. And we did it in association with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We have Yale University Press distributing the book. And the reason that we did this book is twofold. One was to further scholarship on the material. And the second reason was to describe a collection and a collector. And the collection is something that my father, H. Richard Dietrich Jr., assembled. And he really started in the 1960s. By 1963, he actually decided to establish the foundation. And what we are as an institution is we're a lending library of objects. And so we're essentially like a library. We put things on loan to institutions, whether they're museums, historic houses, places like Mount Vernon for special exhibitions. And it's something that I think is an effective model for us. And again, we wanted to do this book to kind of describe who we are and what we do. So one of the first things that we did is you can see the cover of the book is up there. And if you could scroll to the next slide. So there's the full cover jacket. And we identified a great design team in Brooklyn, New York, named Miko McGinty and Company. And she and her small team helped us every step of the way on this. The other thing that we did is we identified great photographers. And so for that, we turned to Gavin Ashworth, and we also turned to Cliff Salen, who's with William Rees and Company, to do the books and manuscripts photography. In doing this, I wrote the introductory section. Our longtime curator, Debbie Rebuck, and I co-edited the book. And then as a board, we identified authors for each of the different component parts. So Kathy Foster at the Philadelphia Museum of Art describes paintings. David Barquest, silver, he's also at PMA. Both of them are on the board of the foundation. Maury Heckscher wrote the foreword. Maury was the longtime curator of the American Wing in New York. And Ned Cook wrote on furniture. Ned is a professor at Yale University. Both Ned and Maury are also on the board. And then the board is rounded out by my brother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and also my wife, Ginger. Further authors, we got Lisa Minardi to do a piece on Pennsylvania German art. Debbie Rebuck, as I mentioned, my co-editor, did a piece on China wares for the American market, China export porcelain. And then William Rees, Bill Rees, who's since passed, sadly, was an amazing books and manuscripts dealer. And he did the part on books and manuscripts. And then Phil Mead at the Museum of the American Revolution did the captions on that. And then finally, Michael Dyer of the New Bedford Whaling Museum wrote on whale trade related art. So if you could scroll to the next slide, please. Yep.
Richard, before you just go on, I think one of the things that I was really interested in, and I might say I don't usually read catalogs, collection catalogs cover to cover. I usually just sort of dip in and out of pieces that I know I'm interested in. But because we were doing this talk, I actually did read it cover to cover. And some of the areas that I didn't think I would be as interested in were really captivating. And the other thing that I noticed is that the range of collections. I don't typically think of your really dedicated books and manuscript collector also being a great decorative arts collector. Mm-hmm. And that combination going back and forth and the connections between some of the books and manuscripts and some of the art and artifacts, I think is something that will really emerge and be very visible as you go on with your images tonight.
Oh, thank you for that, Susan. Those are great comments. One thing related to that that I forgot to mention, that the way we approach this is each of the authors described, they chose the pieces to put into their sections, but they described them in the order that they came in. And that's something that Bill Rees started us off with, was this draft on books and manuscripts, and everybody else followed along. But what, as a reader, that gives you is a chance to kind of flip through and look at paintings and then look at books and manuscripts and maybe look at silver. And you can see what H. Richard Dietrich, my father, was collecting in the 60s and 70s and kind of how his collecting habits changed. So thank you for that. Well, here's a picture of him, Richard Dietrich, my father. And this was taken about 1963. So he graduated from Wesleyan University in 1960. He was about 25 here. And his collecting really started when he was an undergraduate at Wesleyan, but it wasn't in material like this. It was more in books that he enjoyed as a reader. So F. Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Herman Melville, and he was collecting maybe second editions, some first editions, kind of what he could get his hands on. But clearly at that time, as an undergraduate, he really decided that collecting was something that he loved. So he graduated, as I said, in 1960, went on to business school. And when he was in business school, his father died. And this was obviously a terrible shock for him. He ended up having to leave business school. And at that point, he had to take on the mantle of the family business and the estate. So maybe if you could scroll to the next slide. So here is the family business. It's kind of hard on the screen to read those labels, but that's Luden's Cough Drop Company in Reading, Pennsylvania. And my grandfather and my great uncle, Daniel and Richard, bought this in 1928. And what's incredible, I mean, what's kind of sort of astounding, is that they did it at the ages of 19 and 24. And so my grandfather was 19, his older brother was 24. And I get into this a bit in the book because it's such an important part of the family history. And it's really such an important part of who my father was and how he got into collecting. But also what was nice to do in the book, first of all, was to research this and get a chance to tell this story. But also it was nice to tell the story of William Loudon, who started Loudon's, and just how that all came to be. So,
and it really hinges on menthol, as I understand it. That was kind of the big breakthrough.
yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, so Loudon was this incredible entrepreneur, and he started at 16 as a candy maker, and he was making Pennsylvania German style candy called mochi, or mochi, and basically it was a clear candy. And then he came up with this idea. He saw these people kind of taking menthol as a sort of as a salve for sore throats, and he thought, what if I could combine those two things? And he worked with a pharmacist and did that. And then he was off to the races. So it's just an amazing thing that he's the one who started that.
Yeah. And I want to say that I grew up with Loudon's Wild Cherry, and so I feel like I have my little part in the founding of this collection.
Yeah, and those don't really taste all that medicinal.
No, that's why I like them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so this again. So let's go to the next slide. So books and manuscripts. He graduated again from college, and he started really was kind of thrown into the family business and out of business school, and a love of history and kind of this newfound ability to buy things sent him on a journey of being a collector. And I think that there are a couple reasons for this. First of all, he was at such an early age sort of being thrust forward in this very difficult time in his life. And this brought him a lot of comfort, and he loved history. He grew to really love the community of collectors. And so this was one of the first purchases in books and manuscripts. And this came, it's a Washington letter, and it's really a detail of the letter. But you can see at the top, Falls of Delaware side, and that's 10 December 1776, and it says, "Dear Lund." And so this is a letter from George Washington to Lund Washington and his nephew and caretaker during the War of Mount Vernon. And my father found this at a sale of a book dealer who had passed and sold his entire collection. And basically, the collection represented kind of the best of this man's, collecting over the many years. And this was one of the first things that my father bought, and it was something that kind of instantly, brought him into the ranks of being a serious collector. And again, this was in 1963, the same date as the picture that we saw, and he was about 25 years old. And what's, again, amazing about this is just the date here, December 10th. The letter goes on. It talks about trembling for the city of Philadelphia, the predicament that the army was in. And then Washington stops the letter and resumes it on the 17th. And then, of course, 8 days later, they cross the Delaware on Christmas night.
And what I think is, this is just a remarkable letter, and what an encouragement. Talk about starting the collection. It's sort of the epitome. This is not just an autograph collecting. This is a letter where you really feel like you see Washington as a person, because as you said, he's worrying about the army, about Philadelphia, and then all of a sudden he switches gears and he tells Lund, "If you could get some holly trees to plant on the circular banks, I should be glad of it." And then he goes on and on and on about these very complicated, working out what horses are going to go with Martha's carriage and his horse breeding. And then he goes back to the army, and it's just a remarkable window into the mind of the commander-in-chief, I think, and the Virginia planter.
Great point, Susan. I agree. And it makes you both think that he's a micromanager, but then also that he must just derive a lot of pleasure thinking about and talking about Mount Vernon when he's in the cold winter. So great points. Next slide, please. Here, this is kind of maybe hard to read on your screens, but this is a a map of that territory. And this is from William Fadden's Atlas of America. It was produced in 1777. And it basically described, I believe, 53 of the areas of conflict in the Revolution. It was used by British officers. And the extent of the detail of these maps, both describing past conflicts and the terrain that the theater of war is on, was a great aid to the British. And you can imagine that even the Americans, being kind of the home team, this is tough to be up against an enemy that has maps like this. Next slide, please. So, okay, this is, speaking of Christopher Jackson and Hamilton, here we have, this is kind of a great Hamilton moment. This is Hamilton, again, it's just a detail, but I thought it was great to see that A. Hamilton, I guess you can see down there. And not quite A. Ham, but A. Hamilton. And what he's doing here is he's writing to a delegate in Connecticut, Jeremiah Wadsworth, and he's imploring Wadsworth to vote for anybody except Jefferson. And I think the quote was, because in Jefferson, we have everything to fear. So again, you can just kind of hear him saying it in the musical. The next slide, please. So this is a copy of the Federalist, and this is a really interesting copy because it's uncut. And so if you were to go and cut each of these pages, you'd be seeing something that hadn't been seen before. And of course, similarly from the musical, this is Hamilton, Madison, John Jay. Hamilton wrote 51 of the essays in the Federalist. And this is actually, it also came from a fascinating sale. It was purchased in 1964, a year after the Lund letter by my father. And the seller here was Henry Flint, and he was selling it to raise money for historic Deerfield in Deerfield, Mass. And so with the purchase of this, again, this was a really important piece. But the next slide is also, this was the same sale, and this is the Acts of Congress, and it's George Washington's copy from 1789. And this really turned out to be the most important book that my father had purchased. And we as an estate sold this, and we did it to raise money for the foundation. And the very, very happy news was that the buyer was Mount Vernon, the Ladies Association. So it's wonderful that this incredible object is at Mount Vernon.
Yeah, and it really has been such a wonderful addition to the collection here. Just gives you goosebumps to open those pages and see Washington's penciled notes in the margin about the powers of the president. And of course, he knew what those powers were. He paid attention during the Constitutional Convention, but it really is like almost like a user's manual as he is taking on this new role and just, underlining what his roles are.
It is amazing to think of him doing that. Yeah. So this map, the reason I showed this was twofold, because first of all, if we had a Sharpie, we could draw Mount Vernon on there.
But don't.
Yeah, on the left side, that kind of arm that goes up is the Potomac, and then about 2/3 of the way up there would be Mount Vernon. And this map, though, this is an important map in its own right. This was delineating the boundary between basically the Penns of Pennsylvania and the Lords Baltimore of Maryland. And it also, of course, shows part of Virginia in doing that. But this was made, it's a woodblock map, and it was made by Franklin in 1733, I believe. It came with a pamphlet, but I'm just showing the map here. But again, it's an early work of Franklin. It was kind of a very early and important work for him as an individual. The next, so Franklin again, this is, the date on this is, what is the date on this?
1766.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah. So this one is this is basically a British rebuttal to the American opposition to the Stamp Act. And Franklin here, this is all his annotations, and he's clearly annotating to write a lengthy rebuttal to this. And it was printed in London, as Susan said, 1766. And my father acquired this in 1970.
And I think it's just, again, this is another one of those things that gives you goosebumps, like you're right there, history as it's happening. Franklin is reading this and saying, well, but no, you know, here's the response.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, it's amazing. So again, this is Benjamin Franklin, while we're on the subject of Franklin. So this just shows kind of the mind of Franklin. It's a little psychedelic. It's a magical circle of circles. And basically, Franklin invented this. And there are 5 different points. And so you'd have the very, very center. And then you can clearly see these 4 points that are right out from the center. And no matter how you travel out along the circle from any one of those 5 points, it sums to 360. And so Franklin in this manuscript is writing to a fellow member of the Royal Academy of Science. And he's telling this individual, kind of, I can't wait to show you all the other properties of this. But it's just amazing. It's the mind of Franklin, you know. And so this one was acquired in 1967, so a couple of years before the Stamp Act piece. So this again, this is Washington and Franklin, and this one's later, and it was written in 1785, and this is George Washington congratulating Benjamin Franklin on all his years of diplomacy in France. And it's just it's a nice letter from the younger Washington to the older Franklin, and it's just a very kind of handsome looking presentation as well that I wanted to show.
And yeah, when I was digging into a little bit of the history of this, I realized that Washington writes this letter, and then I think before he gets it posted, or the next day, he gets Franklin's letter telling him that Houdon is on the way to sculpt Washington's bust. So again, you just make all these different connections.
Oh, that's great, Susan. That's a great mention. Yes. So this is jumping away from maps and manuscripts, and this is part of the Export China collection, and these are interesting. This is about 1800 or so, and these are custard cups, but it was part of an entire service. And what's depicted there, it's a little hard to see, but you have a depiction of Washington's tomb. So Washington, as we know, died in 1799. And there was no tomb at the time. The tomb, of course, is at Mount Vernon. It wasn't built until years later. But it's basically a depiction of a tomb with an eagle on top, and there's a weeping willow in the background of each. And I think what's fascinating about this, first of all, is sort of the global component of this, and how quickly after his death these were produced. And it was a depiction, but there was this veneration of Washington, this need to honor him. And these went to a Philadelphia family, and I believe that the family was Joseph Sims. So anyway, just a fascinating thing. And then, of course, as we know, the tomb comes much later. And then, of course, there's the Washington Monument much later than that. So again, just Washington, first of all, this is to demonstrate that Washington's a big part of the collection, and Washington was obviously such a big part of American history. These are a little hard to see, maybe. The Washington part, I think you can see pretty easily. These are 2 sperm whale teeth, part of the whale trade, and sailors on boats would scrimshaw these, as we all have seen in pictures. But it's kind of rare to see Washington on one. And then you, in fact, have Martha Washington on the other pair. And below Washington on that tooth on I believe it would be your left, is a depiction of a whaling scene. And then above Martha is a really beautifully rendered urn. So these teeth are significantly later. They'd be 1840s. But it's just a continued kind of veneration of Washington. And
Richard, I don't remember, how big are these?
These are about 6-7 inches tall. They're big. They're big, and they're not, sort of the very best of scrimshaw, but some elements of them are really great. And we don't know who the scrimshander was on these. So this is basically in the 1960s. At the end of the 1960s, my father moved out from Villanova, and he moved out to Chester Springs, and he and his two brothers both bought up a lot of land. And the idea of the land was to actually start a dairy farm and to do farming. And the reason for the dairy farm was to supply milk chocolate to Luden's cough drops. And it wasn't just cough drops. There were Fifth Avenue bars and all sorts of seasonal candy, and milk chocolate was a big thing. And they bought about 1,500 acres out in Chester County, about 40 miles west of Philadelphia. So the next slide. So this is the cow barn. I think Washington may have been proud of something like that. It was pretty state of the art at the time. This was the late 1960s. The sad thing is that the moment that it really came into production, best practices in candy making moved away from fresh milk and went to powdered milk. So none of the milk from this facility ever made it into Fifth Avenue bars. It's kind of funny, though, because some of the Fifth Avenue bars made it into the cows. As candy was made in the conveyor belt, there were broken candy bars. They actually collected some of those and brought it and kind of used it as part of the ground up meal for cows. And I was giving this presentation to one of my daughters in her first grade class, and one of the kids said, "Oh, so that's where chocolate milk comes from." So I thought that was great. The next slide. So this land, all of this land is now, in fact, in conservation. And what we ended up doing is working with a land trust called Natural Lands Trust in Pennsylvania. And this is a great tree on the property, and it kind of became the symbol of the effort. But about 600 acres is park and preserve, and then 900 acres is owned by individuals, either farming it or having their houses out there. But about 10 miles runs through all of that. And so those are bike paths and jogging paths, walking paths. This is my father's house, and this house abutted that land, wasn't directly on it, but his property was right next to it. And this house, so as we kind of saw that he did all this book and manuscript collecting, he bought the house in the late 60s. He worked on it a bit. In about 1972, we moved in. And basically the original part of the house, where you see that kind of great tree in front of it, to the right of the house, the original part was a room over room that was built in 1721. And then it was in the same family for about 200 years, and it was added onto over all those years. And he didn't add anything else onto it. He just kind of fixed it up and did things to it. But when he moved into this house, first of all, it was kind of like this incredible inspiration for that time period. The house, in fact, was a mile down the road from the first military hospital in the United States. It was in Yellow Springs. The house is in Chester Springs. And the military hospital was commissioned by Washington. And in fact, during really when the troops were in Brandywine and also Valley Forge, some of the sick, not so much the wounded, but the sick, were transported out there. And there was a lot of overflow, and they were put up, in fact, at this house owned by Miller. It was Miller's farm. It was very productive, and there were Revolutionary War soldiers convalescing there. And so this was, as a child, this was a big part of my growing up, and this was something that really inspired my father. And so the next slide, this is an interior of the house. This was our den. And as you can see, he was furnishing it with Colonial, furniture, Chester County desk, and different paintings and chairs. And it really, at that point, his collecting kind of shifted into more of the decorative art and some of the paintings and fine art. But he still continued to collect books and manuscripts and maps throughout his time. If we go to the next. And so this is something that we just as a foundation, the Dietrich American Foundation, we opened this exhibit in early February at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And of course, like everything else, COVID shut this down with the museum. And so it had a run of February 1st until mid-March, and then it kind of went into suspended animation. And now, in fact, it's reopened, and it was due to close June 5th, or June 7th, I'm sorry. And it'll now stay open until November 15th. So if anybody is in the Philadelphia area and has a chance to go to the museum, which is now reopened, you know, this would be a fun visit to make. But if you're unable to do that, you can certainly see a lot of these images in the book, not of the exhibit, but the objects. So this, as you can see, there are just different thematic areas of the exhibit. We have some China trade related things and Japan influence. That's a japanned high chest over there by an artisan named John Brocas. And it's a Queen Anne style, and it has, it's hard to really see that, but it has this, what was called Japanning. And so it's this enamel work that was put on, and it's just exquisitely beautiful, and some China trade paintings, painting of a Hong merchant. And then on the right side of that is Pennsylvania related stuff. And kind of a great quilt there depicting the life of President Buchanan, of all people. So then the next slide. So this is the Philadelphia related art and fine and decorative art, some silver. And the next. This is a New England installation. This is kind of a great Newport bureau by John Goddard. There's a slate top table there that you can see, and then a great portrait by John Singleton Copley that you can see of a Boston merchant. So the next, this is the whale trade related items, just a little sampling of them. We don't have the Washington teeth in there, but a great bent harpoon, which is actually, you know, was lodged in a whale and kind of bent during, I guess, probably a Nantucket sleigh ride kind of thing. So
the Washington teeth, I believe, are still on loan here at Mount Vernon, and we had them on display in our books and manuscripts gallery. So that's why you don't have them there. We were very honored to be able to share them with our audiences here. And I think it's fascinating how the collection includes, you know, both the art of the whalers, but also their tools.
Yeah, you know, it's an area that it's sort of outside of the collection because it's really much later in time. The collection, if you kind of did a bell curve of the collection, you know, about 67% of it would fall between 1740 and 1800. The whaling, of course, is mostly 1830s, 1840s, but it was just a true fascination of my father. And that's why the foundation has so much of it. And it's not just the implements and the sailor-made art, it's also whaling logbooks and other things related to kind of recordings of the trade.
Yeah, and portraits of ships.
Yes, good point.
So, and you know, another connection to Washington that I really didn't realize until I got to Mount Vernon, but Washington was very quick to invest in argan lamps when they were invented because they produced better light. And of course, they used whale oil, and that was part of what sparked the growth of the whaling trade.
That's amazing. I did not know that, Susan, that Washington was quick to invest in those. This is in the most formal room of our home growing up. And I show this because you'll see a couple images of these things in the exhibition. But this is a great, again, a John Singleton Copley portrait, in this case, of a young boy, John B. Holmes, and his pet squirrel. And below that is a Paul Revere teapot. And then there's also kind of a great photograph of Lady Bird Johnson with this very painting in the White House. And she had sent a photograph in appreciation for being able to put it on loan. And then below that is this really great, really the first great piece of furniture that he acquired, this Boston Bombay desk by Nathaniel Gould. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see then we tried to, Debbie Reebok, our curator, did such a magnificent job putting together this show, and she tried to, kind of recreate that scene. Of course, there had to be the case for the so that nothing gets knocked off the top of the bureau, and actually next to that is also a Revere print that was on top of the bureau at home.
Yeah, of the Boston Massacre.
Yeah.
But this painting is one that really intrigues me. There are several by Copley that have these pet squirrels, and I always found that so curious. And one of the points Kathy Foster makes in her write-up about this piece is that training a wild squirrel to be a pet required discipline, patience, and perseverance. And so having that in the portrait with the little boy is not just sort of a sign of this, very well-off child, but also it's sort of a moral, a symbol in there, which I didn't know.
I agree. I think that was fascinating. Her write-up, I love it. And it was also very rare that Copley would paint a child. And so this boy was, clearly very beloved, and I think he was an only child, and really kind of people adored him. And I thought that was fascinating as well, that the symbolism of the squirrel, not just a beloved pet to the boy,
Right.
but something that showed his sort of seriousness as a young man. So again, there's a close-up of the Revere print and the teapot. And then here's a little Washington section. This is a Edward Hicks painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which is later, but just a wonderful depiction. And then in the case, which it's very hard to see, but in the case is the portrait miniature that graces the cover of the book. You'll see that in close-up soon. And then there's an Order of the Cincinnati piece. It was actually the first piece that my father, of decorative art that he collected. He listened to a lecture by Eleanor Gordon, who used to deal in export porcelain. And it was kind of, he had bought some Washington items before, but this was the first piece of Washington decorative art, and it was something that he loved.
Yeah. And I really love the way this painting brings us back kind of to the beginning to connect with that letter to Lund, Washington, which is written just a few days before this moment would have occurred.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's great. So here's the portrait miniature, and this was painted by James Peel. It's painted on ivory. And Kathy Foster, again, in her section, writes about how this is such a kind of a glowing little portrait of Washington. And James Peel served for 3 years in the Continental Army, and he really did have an adoration of Washington. And he trained under his older brother, Charles Wilson Peel. And I believe that in 1788, Washington sat for the older brother for a full portrait, and Peel also painted this miniature at the time. And so this then descended in the Peel family, and it was then purchased by a militia, a volunteer militia, the Artillery Corps, the Washington Greys in Philadelphia. And they are the ones who put it in this gold watch case.
And if I understand correctly, before it was part of the watch case, it was the lid of a snuff box?
That's correct. Yes.
Which is really fascinating, I think.
It really, no, I agree. Amazing. Here, this is just one of the great little reveals of the miniature, is that it has a lock of Washington, or a couple locks of Washington's hair in there. And on the back, we have a scene of Washington crossing the Delaware.
And this is, I think, dates from 1843. So it's just a few years before Emanuel Leutze paints his more famous now scene of, these scenes show Washington as the troops are leaving from the Pennsylvania shore, and you can see the boats kind of going across. And of course, Leutze takes that and puts Washington in the boat, makes it that much more action filled, so that these scenes, which were so popular in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, are really now almost forgotten, because the Leutze Washington crossing the Delaware is so ingrained on our imaginations.
That's a great point. And Susan, can you tell, just before this talk, Susan and I were going over our notes, and Susan made a great discovery that sadly there's also a part of this case, the other side depicts Mount Vernon, showing the portico of Mount Vernon. And can you?
Right. Well, this is one of
that?
the geeky things that curators do is, we look at all the different images of Mount Vernon and we can be very attuned to the minute differences between them. And I started looking at it, and of course it's a very small piece. It is illustrated in the book if you want to check this out yourself. But I counted the pillars on the piazza. Now, on the real Mount Vernon, there are 8 pillars, 8 pilasters, 4 on either side of the central axis doorway. But on this little engraving on the watch case, there are 9. So my guess is that the engraver was not one of the pilgrims who came to Mount Vernon. He was probably looking at maybe a small book illustration. And when you get the east front at an oblique angle, it can be very hard to sort out the pilasters from the edge of the building. So we have a new view of Mount Vernon with 9 pilasters. So that's my little discovery for the day.
It's another reason I'm glad I did this talk. Now we have this discovery to thank for.
We'll never see it the same way.
Exactly. Well, and so then here's this piece from Yale University Press. And again, if anybody's interested in buying the book, you can buy it wherever books are sold, and on online or hopefully in bookstores. But again, if you do buy it through Yale, there is this at the bottom, YEIPH is a 25% discount that they've offered for this. And the other thing I do want to say is that normally this would be a book signing. And I'm happy to say that if anybody does buy the book or has already bought a book and wants me to sign something, if you email me, I'm going to just give you my email address. It's hricharddietrich, Dietrich. So hricharddietrich @yahoo.com. And if you just email me, I'm happy to send you a little note that would serve as an inscription book.
Oh, that's very sweet. That's really wonderful. Well, it's just really, and you've given us such a rich personal look at what is truly one of the, I think, great collections of Americana formed in the late 20th, early 21st century. And, we so often hear the laments like, well, collecting isn't what it used to be, and you can't find anything like you could back in the good old days. And I think it's really amazing the things that do keep popping up, and your father was certainly very successful in his search for really incredible items that as you say in your introduction, tell stories about the founding era.
Well, thank you, Susan. I think, one of the things that he loved was connecting these objects and really kind of getting a chance to. The title of the book is In Pursuit of History, and it really was a pursuit of, as a collector, as trying to kind of connect with history and bringing these items together. And so I really enjoyed writing this book and being part of the team that wrote the book.
Yeah, well, your pleasure in it is obvious, and I think we're ready now to open this up to questions from the audience.
Perfect.
So, first question we have from Nielsen. Could you, Richard, tell us something about the work of the foundation in conservation? Does the foundation do its own conservation, or how do you address taking care of these precious objects for future generations?
Yeah, sure. So we actually have a great, we're very, very lucky. We have Debbie Rebuck has her office at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and we have access to the conservation labs and storage at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We're really thankful to the museum for that. And for the past 4 years, in fact, Chris Storb was working as a consultant with us, and he's still consulting with us on other things. But Chris Storb is a great conservator, and he did a comprehensive survey of our furniture and a lot of conservation work on the furniture. And so that's an ongoing thing. It is something that we're continually trying to look for things that aren't quite right about the pieces, maybe a repair that was made in the past and isn't quite right, or fixing things that never were fixed. It's a great point, Nils. Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Well, I'll ask another question, and perhaps you want to dodge this one. I don't know, but there was a wonderful quote that you had in the book, sort of talking about living in that old house in Pennsylvania, and it was a quote from a Robert Frost poem.
Yeah.
Learn to rattle the lock and key, to give whatever might chance to be, warning and time to be off in flight. So I think that just brings to mind, I grew up in a 1890s Queen Anne farmhouse in the Midwest, but so that was an old house, and a lot of kids I went to school with thought it was kind of Addams Family spooky. But what was it like growing up with surrounded by all these wonderful artifacts? Were you kind of conscious of their significance at the time, or was that something you kind of grew into?
Well, one of the things that was great about it is that my father was just somebody who loved history, and he loved sharing stories about history and the objects. And growing up, it was a real treat to grow up with these things. And I felt like, a lot of the really fine stuff was already in the foundation and already in museums. But we did grow up with, as you could see from that Bombay chest and some of the other things. Granted, that was the formal room, and it was kind of the room where if you were in there and my father came in, he'd kind of say, what are you doing in here? So, it was sort of a room that we didn't go into a lot. But that I love that Frost poem because it was a kind of spooky place, but it was home and we loved it. And there were always stories about ghosts, and there was sort of this feeling that all these generations of people who lived there and the soldiers who were convalescing there. And it was a place that kind of had a spookiness, but just also an incredible warmth to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I love that poem. I think that was fun.
Yeah, that was great. Do we have another question there from our audience? Cynthia asks, what is the oldest item in the collection and what is its provenance?
Oh, gosh, that's a tough one. I don't know. The short answer is exactly what the oldest item is. But really the period was really kind of 1690-ish would have been the oldest items that are in the collection. The fascination that he had was really more in the colonial period. So really kind of those 1720s and 30s on up.
And maybe we have another question from Brian. Brian is sort of really getting down and dirty. Do you collect anything?
Yeah, my wife and I try to collect a little bit. It's one of these things where, I mean, my father really had the means to delve into this, but we love a couple things. We love portrait miniatures, these little depictions, especially of kids. I think it's really just amazing to see how people depicted children. And a lot of these some of them are colonial, some of them are, sort of more federal period. And then the other thing that we just enjoy are glass bottles. And so these sort of pattern molded flasks, and they're brilliant colors. And we have a shelf that we've lit underneath, and so it's fun. But they also are incredible stories in their own right. They're great works of art, and they're geographically so different. So it shows the different regions of the country and the kind of tastes that are evolving.
Great. Well, here's another great question. I think this has maybe come in from other people, and it takes us in the direction of talking about the foundation, which you've talked about a little bit. And I think it's really interesting that, your father from very early on started the collection and started the foundation basically at the same time, and apparently never had the idea, as many great collectors do, of starting his own museum. but envisioned a quite different way of sharing this with the public, and that is through the foundation. And so the question specifically is, how does someone or an organization go about borrowing objects from the foundation collection? And perhaps you can talk just a little more broadly about that lending library strategy.
Yeah, sure. Now, that's a great question. I'm really glad it was asked. So the foundation, again, we do really try to put these things out on loan. The biggest concentration of objects that are on loan are at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the galleries, either on, in some cases, like the silver permanent deposit, in many cases, very long-term deposit. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art is, in fact, undergoing a transformation of its American galleries. And so hopefully in the spring, it was actually due to happen this fall, those galleries will be unveiled hopefully next spring. And quite a lot of the foundation's items are going to be on loan there. But at the same time, we really try hard to put these out on loan at a range of museums, historic houses, institutions. And the short answer to that is, at any given time, there are about 30 different places that have items from the foundation. But we have a website, and it's basically DietrichAmericanFoundation.org. And you can go to that website, and there's a database of objects that can be accessed through a program called Past Perfect. But people can search the database to kind of see the types of objects we have. And there's contact information on the website. And if there's an organization that is in need of objects for either a special exhibition or a longer term loan, we're all ears. I mean, this is what we want to do. And there have been some happy occurrences with this. There's a museum in Columbia, South Carolina. And about 10 years ago, curator went there and he wanted to kind of transform the American galleries. And there wasn't a lot of American decorative art. And so we put a number of things on loan. And the happy occurrence was that some of their local patrons said, "Oh, this is great. I didn't even know you all collect this kind of stuff." And they started getting loans locally and even gifts. And they got some foundation grants. And then over time, we backed out those items. So it sort of served this great, temporary purpose.
Yeah, that's a great story. And one of our listeners has said many historic house museums have benefited from loans from the foundation. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's nice. Thank you.
It's really nice to hear that. And I know I know you said you have about 30 at any given time. You have a list of loan locations at the back of the book, which I counted. Another one of those geeky things I did. But there are 111 different loans listed from the foundation from 1963 to 2019. And not just to big major museums, places that you would think of, but supporting a lot of, as you suggested, local historical societies, local historic houses that might not have an opportunity to show their audiences this kind of material.
It's a great point, Susan. I'll just say quickly about historic houses. I think they're so important, and they're constantly under, kind of budget pressure. And it's harder and harder to get loans from museums just because of the kind of red tape and the climate requirements that are required. But with a foundation like ours, we can be a little bit more nimble and put things on loan at historic houses and be just a little less concerned about climate with some items that are really very durable anyway.
Yeah.
And we're happy to do that. We'd love
to. Certainly a great service to the field. From Tim, we have another question. Is there anything in the collection about Washington's relation to the Indians?
Yeah, there are a number of things in the collection that relate to his relationship with the Indians. There's a great broadside that's shown in the book, and I'm going to try to find it, but it's basically Washington talking to the Cherokee Nation. Mm-hmm. And I believe that he delivered the speech in Philadelphia, but then it was distributed out in the Cherokee region. And Washington is basically trying to get the Indians to be more agricultural. And when we read it with a 21st century, sort of view, we also see that he's, he has very particular views of Native Americans and even women. And yes, that's it. Thank you. And I was on a talk with Wesleyan University, and Professor Demetrius Udall talked specifically about that broadside. And that's on YouTube if anybody, would want to see that. But if you do get the book and you read that, it's just very interesting to read. And it's Washington. Again, really, it's an effort at diplomacy with the Cherokee Nation, but it's also trying to get them to kind of get away from some of their ways and really be much more agricultural and focused on crops.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sarah asks, are there any textiles in the collection? I know you pointed to the quilt that was in the exhibit that was kind of a memorial to James K. Polk, who was from Pennsylvania, as I recall.
Actually, it was to Buchanan.
Buchanan, I'm sorry.
Yes, but no, it's a good question. There are not a lot of textiles, but there are some in terms of upholstery on furniture, and so that is an area where, in some cases we have original upholstery, and then in other cases we have done a lot of detective work to figure out what the upholstery would have been, and so we're reupholstering with the same, color and kind of materials. So textiles are important to us, but we are really not a textile-rich collection, but a fascinating area. And, a little bit on fire screens and stuff like that, but not a lot.
And John asks, and I think this is a great question, in preparing the book, did you feel that you discovered or learned anything new about your father?
Yeah, I really did. I felt as a child, that was, as a child of somebody, that was a great thing to do. And one of the things that I really delved into, and I didn't really need to do it, but it just felt like I should do it with the family history that I was doing. I did some discovery work on Ancestry.com and built a family tree. It's just amazing how quickly you can do that these days. And so I made some really interesting discoveries there about family. And then with my father, certainly in delving into these objects and looking at how he collected them and when he collected them, I made a lot of discoveries. And I just wish I could have asked him more questions about, why did you pick this thing, or where did this interest come from? So it was a great process for me. It was a lot of fun.
Did he have notes or journals or anything like that in terms of his collecting journey?
He did. I mean, our records for the Dietrich American Foundation are really extensive in terms of purchases and letters. And in those days, so much of it was letters back and forth about dealers. And so all of that we've preserved, and that's just a rich window into a collector. And then he was interesting too, because when it came to catalogs, he'd do a lot of annotations in collection catalogs and annotating things that he might have been interested in or just curious about. And so those are fun to go through too, and to, kind of discover what he was thinking about these different pieces.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So I think we're looking at just a couple more questions here.
Mm-hmm.
Kate asks, there were many items given to Washington from foreign admirers during or after his presidency. What happened to the majority of his gifts? Did he save them at Mount Vernon, or were they given away to other families or to other people after his death? Well, I don't know if you want to jump in on that, Richard, but that may be more a question for me at Mount Vernon than for you.
Yeah, that sounds like you, Susan.
Yeah, that's a great question. Many of the things that were given to Washington, he did retain. Some of them came back with him to Mount Vernon. For example, we have the print, the engraving of King Louis XVI in its original palace frame that was a presentation from the French foreign minister. So kind of like all Washington things, there wasn't a sense of creating a Washington library or a Mount Vernon museum at the time he died. It was family property. things that were acquired for the president's house were offered to John Adams. But much of the Washington material got split up and has found its way all over the country, all over the world after his death. And we do our best to bring it back to Mount Vernon at every opportunity that we get.
Yeah. Great answer.
Do we have one last question for Richard? What is your favorite object in the collection?
Yeah, so I think really, I mean, one of them is certainly that portrait miniature, and we put it on the book, and it's something that, you know, is just so beautiful. It's so fragile in it being watercolor, and I love it for that, you know, the kind of the depiction of Washington and the fragility of it and the story behind it.
Well, there have been so many great stories this evening, Richard, both on different levels, stories of the objects in the collection, stories of the collecting of your father, of your this very sort of personal look at collecting and how it has touched your life and the many historic houses and museums that have benefited from the foundation's generosity. I want to thank you for joining us tonight and for just really your labor of love in putting together this book and exhibition. I hope people will get a chance to visit it in Philadelphia. I just want to say that both the mansion and our museum galleries are open again at Mount Vernon now, so you can come and visit Washington objects here in situ. We hope you'll come and join us. We hope you'll come back virtually. We, of course, have a full lineup of programs coming up. The next ones coming up next week, we will be having our founding debates on September 24th at 7 p.m., focusing on pandemics in American history, which certainly is very timely. On the 24th, we will also be having the announcement of this year's George Washington Book Prize and with a live stream conversation with the winners. So stay tuned for that. Thank you to all of our watchers and listeners out there. We're just terribly thrilled to have you with us this evening. Thank you for your continuing interest in Mount Vernon, your support of Mount Vernon. We really value that support. We need that support, and we hope that you will continue in that vein. So thank you, Richard. Thank you to all our guests, and good evening.
Susan, thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you to you and Mount Vernon and the listeners as well, and also to all the staff who made this possible. Thank you, Susan. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, Richard. Next time you do a book, we'll do it again.
Okay. That's a good incentive.
Okay. Good night.